Welcome to the ProLife Team podcast. I'm Jacob Barr, and I'm here with Dan Kulp. And we're going to talk about some very beautiful stories of adoption, amazing stories about adoption, and how for him and his wife, it was their plan A. Dan, I'm excited to be on this podcast with you. Would you introduce yourself as if you were talking to a small group of executive directors and pro-life friends?
Sure. All right. Well, hello, friends. My name is Dan Kulp. It is such a privilege to be here before you today. I have an amazing story, and I enjoy telling it, but I use stand-up comedy to do that, to kind of unravel it for the audience. But it's an extremely pro-life story, and I use my story to help tell your story all over the country, and hopefully raise more money than you've ever raised at previous events. That's always my goal, but it's because of your life-saving work, and you're my superhero. So it is really truly an honor to be able to do that work and to partner with you for the cause of life.
Awesome. So Dan, you wrote a book.
I did.
What's the title of your book?
The book is called Confounding the Lies, and it's a celebration of life, love, laughter, adoption, and the joy of children with special needs.
Yeah, and so I read this. You gave it to me at the Heartbeat conference, right?
Mm-hmm.
And
Yep.
I read part of it on my flight home, and I finished it up. It was really good. Like, I had a hard time putting it down. It was really
Great. Well,
enjoyable to
thanks.
read. I could hear your voice, like the way you talk throughout that book, which made it just enjoyable to
Good.
read
Yeah.
through it.
Great.
So
I
tell
wish
me,
I sounded like Morgan Freeman for you, because then you would have heard his voice. But unfortunately, you heard
yeah.
my Rochester, New York accent.
So my first question for you is, what does adoption represent to you? How would you summarize your feelings or thoughts around adoption?
Well, adoption, as you know from reading the book, was a huge part of my life growing up. My brother Matthew was born a year after I was. I was my parents' fifth child, and he was their sixth. And he was born in 1971, and he had Down syndrome. And a lot of people told my parents the same thing. They told him to get rid of him and put him away in an institution and forget he was ever born. And my parents, they didn't like that idea very much. So they made the radical decision back in the 70s to keep Matthew and raise him. And Matthew ended up being such a blessing to the family that my parents went out and they adopted three more children with Down syndrome. And that's the experience I had growing up. My older brothers and sisters were all 10, 11, 12 years older than I was. But my brother Matthew, who was only a year from me, and my new siblings, we were all around the same age. So again, that was a huge part of my life growing up. And so it shaped my being from a very early age. And one thing that I noticed was, growing up, people would see our family and they would say something like, so which ones are your real brothers and sisters? And I still get that today with my own children that we've adopted. People say, okay, so who are your real children? And I would say, even as a little kid, and I say it now as a dad, I'll say, well, they're all my real children, or they're all my real brothers and sisters, because that's how I always felt. And my parents treated us that way. There was never a difference in the amount of love that they had for their biological children as opposed to the children that they adopted. And I never sensed any difference between my biological siblings and my adopted siblings too, because our lives are so interwoven from an early age. And I can testify to that as a parent. I don't love my biological children more than I love my adopted children. God, that's, I think, one of the miracles of adoption.
And your story with of adoption, when it comes to going to China and adopting, can you sort of give us an intro to your story when it comes to adoption in China?
Sure. Well, so I used to years ago tour the country in a rock band, and And I was dating this woman, Elizabeth, and we were kind of on again, off again. And at one point, I was headed out on the road for about 2.5 months, and she felt this tug on her heart. She was a physical therapist. She still is, actually. And she just felt like God was calling her to, as she put it, and I love this phrase, and I actually will say this at the events for the PRCs. She felt like she wanted to do something for something greater than just a paycheck. And see, right there, I know that all of the folks that work for PRCs knows exactly what she's talking about, because nobody's getting rich off of working at a PRC. And she found herself, because of that tug on her heart, she found herself in rural China, working in orphanages, and particularly orphanages for children with special needs. And when she was there, she witnessed some wonderful things about the people and the culture and the history of China, but she also witnessed some pretty horrendous things, things that would make your stomach just churn. And she came home on a mission that her first children were going to be adopted. She wanted to send the message to people that, so many people look at adoption as a plan B for their life. You can't have children, so, okay, we're going to adopt. But she wanted it to send the message that adoption can certainly be plan A for a couple. God is on board with adoption. He's very excited about it. We have examples in scripture of adoption. And oftentimes that was his plan for his people. So she came home and she told me her story about the specific things that she witnessed, and it completely changed my life. Prior to that, I hadn't really cared a whole lot about children, especially babies on the other side of the world. And God used her story to crack my heart wide open. And also since then has given me quite a platform to be able to share her story in a very powerful and poignant way. And for my what I bring to the table is also humorously. But so when we got married, she said, I have 2 requirements for any man I'm going to marry. The first one is he has to be willing to adopt an orphan from China. And she said, I have to get 1 out. If it's the only thing I can do, I have to do that much. And the second requirement was that man had to be intensely good looking.
Nice.
So I think she nailed it, right? I mean,
yeah. check them
I was
off.
in Atlanta, Georgia at one time doing this bit, and some lady yelled out from the back of the auditorium, "Who'd she marry?"
Oh, that's funny. So when it comes to going to so what have you what was your experience like when it came to day one in China? Like what did it feel like to be there in China when you went there at one point? Like what did it feel like when you got off the plane and there you are? What were your thoughts from back then?
Yeah, it was a lot of wonder and excitement, but also a little bit of anxiety, stress level, because I'm the kind of person that really change isn't, I'm not always great with change. And when I'm going into new situations, I'm a little stressed. I don't suffer from severe anxiety or anything like that. I don't need a comfort monkey with me or anything, but there was a little bit of stress. Like I'm going into this, brand new country, different language, different money, different even smell in the air. It was just very, very different. The one thing I had though was my wife, who had been there on 2 previous trips. So she did that initial trip to China for a few months. And then after we were married, she did another trip to China for a couple months. Again, I was on the road with the band. So she said, well, if you're going on the road with the band, I'm going to go to China and work. And she just felt such a calling to be there. So I had her with me. So that helped a lot because she knew her way around. She knew what we were getting into. And we were with a wonderful adoption agency that provided us interpreters. And we were also, for those 2 trips for 2 of our children, we were with a group of families that were also there to adopt orphans from China. So you're kind of like on a bus together and you go to the hotel together. And as far as being in China itself, it was actually a wonderful trip. And by the second time we went, I was looking forward to it. The Chinese people, and I'm kind of generalizing here, but they really want to please the visitors to their country and people who are there, whether it's for business or whether it's to adopt a child. They want to kind of impress and they want to serve you. Whether they like you or not is sort of irrelevant. They just really want you to have a good impression. And so we were kind of, served, and there were these neat trips that were planned while we were there. Got to see the Great Wall of China, and we went to Beijing, and really terrific trip, to the point where the second time around, I wasn't stressed about it. I was like, oh, great, we get to go back to China. Later on, as you know, we went to Ukraine, and that was stressful because neither of us had been there. And Ukraine is a whole different vibe. They don't like Americans all that much. Maybe they like them better now with all that's going on, but they really didn't. And even though we looked more similar than we do to the people of China, they could tell you we're American, which was really strange. They could tell you we're not from Ukraine. And we were met with a lot of, harsh looks, and almost felt very antagonistic. But then, as you read in my book, there were some also really wonderful moments and people that we met there as well. So yeah, great trips.
How do you think your adoption story might have changed the Chinese government's outlook on adoption and children with Down syndrome?
Yeah, so it's an amazing story how we got connected with Simon. He'd been abandoned in the woods in the middle of winter on the day he was born, and he was immediately he was taken care of by the couple people that found him in the woods, snow beginning to cover his little body. And then relatively quickly, somehow he got put into a foster home as that were run by a British doctor and her husband, as opposed to an orphanage. And so when he was in the foster home, he met two wonderful people and their kids, named Stephen Curtis Chapman and Mary Beth Chapman, and their kids, who were there in China working, like volunteering at this foster home, because they were friends with this British doctor and her husband. And so if it wasn't for that chain of events, we never would have ended up with Simon, who we've been told is the first child let out of China to the US who has Down syndrome. The Chapmans met him, kind of fell in love with him. He was so adorable. And they lobbied the Chinese government to put him on the waiting child list. One of the reasons he's the first is because at the time, China was a very prideful nation, and they didn't want the rest of the world to know that they had what they considered to be imperfect children. So they hide them and put them away, just kind of like they did in our country back in the 70s, like my parents were told to do. And that's what they would do. They would say they were adopting out children with special needs, but there were very correctable issues like cleft palates, or club feet in some occasions, things like that. But to the extent of Down syndrome, they had never even really considered doing that. Once we adopted Simon, I don't know from their perspective how it happened, but after that, they began to realize, oh, there's parents out there who are willing to adopt these children. They didn't necessarily understand it, but they were willing to put them on the waiting child list. And so, like I said, I give all the credit to the Chapmans, because if it weren't for them, he wouldn't have, he may be in an orphanage to this day, or even worse, set out onto the street to fend for himself.
Yeah, so tell us more about the family who found Simon covered in snow in the woods. What was that family doing in the woods when they happened to come across Simon?
Yeah, they were hired by a wealthy landowner, and that part I don't quite understand, because I didn't know that you were allowed to own land in China. It's a communist country. But the story we were told, they were hired by this landowner to clear the woods of debris and downed branches and things like that, to get it ready for the springtime. Now, this was his birthday's on January 28th. So spring was just a few months away, but apparently whoever owned this property wanted them. He hired these people who were relatively poor. He was paying them to go in and clear the property. And so as they were doing that, they came upon his little body laying there with snow beginning to cover it. We had the opportunity the next trip, about a year later, to meet that man. His name was Mr. Han, by the way, and his wife. And when we went for the second trip to adopt our daughter, Danielle, my wife had this crazy idea like, hey, I want to go meet the family that found our son and saved his life. And at first I was very unenthusiastic because I thought, honey, there's a lot of people here. Like how are we gonna find this man in all of China? How are we gonna find him? But she had a one-page police report written in Chinese. She hired a college student to be our interpreter. She hired a driver, and off we went. I think they were about, I don't know, an hour and a half north of Beijing. And if I remember my geography correctly, I might be off. But we went, and ended up going to the police station. They sort of translated this, that we showed them the police report. They told us where the woods was listed on there. We went to the woods, we walked around, and then we got back in the car and off to this little village we went, where the police told us was this man, where he lived, Mr. Han. Ended up finding him thanks to our driver. He flagged down a person who's walking along the road, almost looked like a peasant, like an old school, peasant. I hate to use that word, but he just looked very poor, and he was an old man. He knew Mr. Han. So, oh, follow me, he said in Chinese. And we started walking through this little village, muddy dirt roads, and almost like hut-like structures. And he walked right into their house. It was a one-room sort of house with mud, dirt floors. And their granddaughter was sitting there blowing up balloons. And she got excited because Americans were there, and she said, I'll run into town and I'll go get my grandpa. And she went into town, and in he walked and met us. And it was a beautiful, beautiful time. We were able to tell him through our translator that, hey, our son Simon is alive and well. We showed him pictures, him smiling, happy, running, jumping, playing. And just were able to show him that our son had value. He had a life that he was living because they chose to take care of him for a few hours until the police arrived.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's such an awesome story of like just being rescued by people who happened to be there. And
happened,
wow.
Yeah.
How did they keep him warm, or how did they warm him up from the snow to, in a simple hut like place?
Yeah, actually, there was like a small like shed on the property, and they told us that they had taken them into there, and they were just, getting them warm and keeping them warm. And one of the things Mr. Han said to me was that he was strong. He said that through our interpreter. He was a strong baby because he was, awake and alert, and he wasn't suffering. He was
Oh,
doing
wow.
pretty well. He had other stuff going on too. He had a club foot. He had what's called an imperforate anus, and that's where his intestines didn't connect to an exit. And he has on one thumb. My wife and I think it's pretty cool. It's an extra little thumb, and so we'll say, Simon, 3 thumbs up, buddy.
Wow. That's So and then it sounds like, so then you mentioned Danielle. So Danielle was when well, how many years later
It was 1 year later.
adoption? 1 year.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, which isn't that typical. Adoptions sometimes are like a 2-3 year process. At least they were at the time. I don't know what they're like now. I don't even know if they're allowing adoptions because of COVID. They probably have restricted those a great deal. But and I don't want to deter anybody from choosing to adopt from there. I just don't know. I'm just not up on what all the regulations are now.
Yeah,
but at the time, it could be a 2-3 year, 4-year process. But when you check a little box that you're willing to adopt a child with special needs, they accelerate that a little bit. And again, when you were checking the box, that meant you would take a child with a cleft palate or something very correctable. And so his adoption process was accelerated. And Danielle, she was listed on the waiting child list for China as the third child with Down syndrome being let out. There was a second child and he was spoken for. A family said they were going to adopt him. So my wife found this third child, said she had Down syndrome and that we should be her parents. So it was only 1 year. Everything got accelerated. We went back to China. She was from a whole different province and a different set of circumstances.
But if I remember correctly from your book, she didn't have she had a different type of
Yeah.
Down syndrome or something
Yeah, so
else that was unique.
Yeah, it's not Down syndrome actually at all. We got her home, and a few weeks or a few months after getting her home, we get called into a doctor's office after they had done some genetic tests, and they said, "We want you to know your daughter does not have Down syndrome. She has something much more rare called Elfie syndrome. It's a genetic mutation. The official name is 9p minus, and it's a deletion of her 9th chromosome. She's missing a chromosome, and it's very rare. At the time, they told us there was about 125 people in the country with it, 250 in the world. Those numbers have gone up. It's still pretty rare, but they've gone up because they're better able to diagnose it now. But
Okay.
they said they kind of gave us what they knew about the condition. But I realized sitting in that office the great sovereignty of God, because if they had known that she didn't have Down syndrome, something they were just becoming comfortable allowing out of their country, but she had something much more rare and complex that they couldn't necessarily explain, they never would have let her out. They would have kept her in the institution for the rest of her life. And so I realized right then and there the great sovereignty of God, that he gave her a false diagnosis to bring her home to her parents.
Wow, because if the Chinese government would have seen that it was a more rare case, they may have responded differently, perhaps. Is that what you're
Yeah,
thinking?
they may have, and I'm sort of doing some guesswork there, but I know that it's so rare they wouldn't have really known exactly what to do with that, possibly. So, and Danielle had been abandoned at a hotel when she was 3 or 4 years old, and that's most likely because that's when her cognitive differences began to emerge. And so, could you imagine bonding with your child for 3 or 4 years? But living in such a culture that doesn't value differences, that you decide, oh, she's different. So you put her in your car, you drive her to a local motel, and then just drop her off to fend for herself. And that's what they did with Danielle.
So Danielle was found abandoned somewhere? Is that?
Yeah, at a hotel. Yeah.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
So when you go speak at an event for a pregnancy clinic, and your goal is to help them, raise support, money, volunteers, what do you tell your story? I know that I mean, I'm sure you probably have a lot of good humor that you bring in at different spots, but when it comes to like your story, do you normally share your adoption stories, or is that something that executive directors usually experience when it comes to your the event
Yeah.
topics?
Yeah, so I use my story again to link to the great work of the PRCs, the life-saving work that they do, and I do that in several different ways. But I use the first part of what I do is sort of stand-up comedy, but it's all about the typical stuff you might see from a dad who does comedy. I'm talking about diaper changing and having a bunch of kids and birthday parties and really bringing humor to it, and the whole time I'm unraveling this story for the audience, but definitely gets to points where there's some great poignancy. So it goes from laughter to like tears and people being choked up. And of course, that all culminates to the end of the story, where I'll lead into what is a very powerful, what they call the ask, which is the financial appeal. And so I'm able to link that entire story to the life-saving work of the PRCs, and really challenge the audience to partner with them for life that night. And I have a fairly good track record of getting people, getting centers more than they made the previous years, because of, there's sort of an art to the ask that a lot of speakers don't necessarily know that art and all that goes into it. It's not rocket science, but I learned it from some of the best speakers out there. and was able to apply it to what I do. And so now I have a pretty effective financial appeal. I don't bat 100. I don't always bring in more than they got the previous year, but I have a pretty good track record for doing that.
So, so what was day number one when you were your first time speaking in front of an event for a pregnancy clinic? What did day number one look like? Was that before the adoptions or after your first adoption?
It was after our first adoption. And I don't know if we had gotten to our second adoption yet. I think we did. But I did a terrible, looking back on it, I didn't do a very good job. I didn't really understand and we're talking like 15 years ago or so. I didn't really understand the work of the pregnancy care centers. And I didn't also really understand my role as the speaker for the event. And it was down in North Carolina. And, they did fine. They made about exactly what they made the previous year. But I think back on some of the mistakes I made, learning what I've learned over the years. And again, from kind of studying the best of the best when it comes to that, I just realized I made some mistakes. I had a ministry that I was connected with when I toured with the band that it was like a relief organization where I would do pitches to sponsor a child from a foreign country. And I was pretty good at doing that. I did it that night. And I think back on it, I go, what was I thinking? Like that, it was their event. I shouldn't have been pitching for this other ministry, but I didn't know any better. I was just I felt like I was a hired gun and they wanted me to do what I always do. So I didn't do a very good job. So now I think, I after having done probably, hundreds of them, I do a much better job. And it's really all about you that night. I tell my story, but it's all for you. I'm there to work on your behalf.
Yeah, so I think your story, especially the way it's laid out in your book, is extremely inspiring. And yeah, it just feels like it's got a strong, I would say it has a strong ask promoting someone to think about adoption for their life as following God's will. And it links adoption with following God and serving God. And it's just, that's just really, and I feel like you really hit a home run right there.
Well, thank you.
But going back to that day one, even though you might have, you obviously have a learning curve experience when it comes to, knowing how things work, and how, you didn't have the advantage of doing it hundreds of times quite yet. But what inspired you to make that connection and get onto that stage the very first time? Like what did it look like to get brought into that space of helping a pregnancy clinic raise support?
I got a phone call one day. I had been telling my story for a couple years up to that point. And I had been being, hired as a comedian or a comedic speaker, a humorist, whatever you want to call it. And I've been doing sort of like youth groups and churches and things like that. And then I had a website up, and I just got called one day from a woman who was a director down in High Point, North Carolina. And she said, she was funny because she told me who she was, said they hire comedians for their fundraising banquets, which, by the way, a lot of center directors don't understand this, but that is one of the best decisions you can make for your fundraising banquet. And I could get into why later, but a lot of directors still have it in mind around the country that they have to bring in the saddest abortion story that they can bring in for their annual banquet, which is a huge mistake because first of all, depressed people don't want to write a big check. They want to be joyful when they give. And why make your banquet a downer? It should be a celebration of the great work that you do. And also, you don't have to do like a sort of abortion apologetics at your banquet. Everybody there that night is on board with that idea. They're all pro-life. That's why they're coming. So you can dispense with that. You're wasting time. You can just, again, celebrate the great work of the PRCs. But anyway, out of the blue, I get this call, and I don't know how she stumbled upon me, but she somehow Google search or something, and she found my story, and she said, we'd like to hire you for this banquet. We do it every year. This is what we are. We're a pregnancy resource center. I think they used to call them pregnancy care centers, and it keeps kind of changing and evolving. And they, what was funny is she said, we've hired through a booking agency in the past, and she was trying to kind of bypass that. She wanted to like go directly to an artist that wasn't represented. I wasn't represented at the time. And so she said, how much? And I gave her a quote, and she actually said, listen, you need to give me a much higher quote, because we have much bigger budgets and you're undervaluing what you do. And so I was like, oh, okay. And I still gave her a relatively, very reasonable quote. So that was my first time. I drove down to North Carolina from New York. It's not because I'm scared to fly. I fly all the time. It's because if I love to drive for one thing, but I always figure like if I can get paid in mileage as opposed to giving that to the airlines, then I would, that's like a little bonus for me. So I drove and I got some mileage out of it. Now with the gas prices, I don't know that it's worth it. I would probably fly to North Carolina now unless I book shows on the way there and the way back, which I tend to do frequently. So yeah, it was great. I stepped out, as you put it, stepped out on the stage. But I didn't know enough. I just didn't, I did my thing, and it wasn't horrible. It's just that I didn't know what I didn't know. And now I know.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Well, yeah, good for her to reach out to you and bring you in, because since then, how many, if you were to estimate how many pregnancy clinics you have, done an event for, how what's the ballpark range that you might have done since then?
Oh, I don't even know.
A lot, probably.
Yeah, a good number. I don't have the most under my belt as some of my friends do in this sort of arena. But I've done a good number of them, and again,
Yeah.
it's just been such a privilege.
So when it comes to so you're currently through an agency. So if someone wanted to find you today, where how would they go about finding you to see if your availability and for booking?
So yeah, the agency that represents me for PRCs is Ambassador Speakers Bureau, and Gloria is the agent that handles all of that sort of stuff, and she's terrific. She's passionately pro-life. Many of your listeners are going to already know who she is, I'm sure. She just does a terrific job, makes it a painless process to book me. And now anybody is able to find me. You can find me on Facebook. You can find me, Google search me or whatever. I have a website. You can find me that way and connect with me. But if you're connected with a PRC and you want me to come, I'll just hand you over to Gloria, not because I'm, too snooty to work with you myself. It's just that they're the ones that really introduced me to that arena, and kind of trained me on how to do it.
Yeah.
And so I let them handle all of that stuff. And I'm very appreciative for them bringing me into that. Again, that first one I did was an isolated sort of call, but Ambassador introduced me to the whole world, and I was able to understand it much better after I got on board with them. So yeah, Ambassador Speakers Bureau, get a hold of them or get a hold of me, and then I'll steer you to them.
Yeah. And when I first met you, I remember thinking, that you were helping with fundraising events as a speaker, using your comedy to really draw people in. But I didn't know your story until I read your book about how you have literally changed, made an impact, made a serious impact for adoption, for life, for those with Down syndrome or these scenarios, and just that adoption world. Like literally, you have made a global, or at least an impact on the Chinese country in that space.
Yeah, again, I don't know if we deserve any credit for that. I give it to the Stephen Curtis Chapman and his wife Mary Beth, because they had some sway and were able to use their, I don't know if they used their celebrity or whatever it was, but they were able to to get him on that waiting child list. All we did was show up to bring him into our family.
Well, you're on the
you
same
know,
team as the Chapmans, it sounds like. You're,
yeah,
he might have been the coach, but you're definitely one of the players on that team.
well, I'm very grateful for their work, put it that way.
Sure. Yeah. Um, how did you, so like your desire and interest in comedy came at a much, well, sounds like it came much earlier in your life. What was your inspiration to be a comedian?
Oh man, I've always loved comedy. I grew up on comedy. First of all, my home was a happy home. There was a lot of laughter. My dad was a really funny guy. My mom's a really funny woman, and laughter was a huge part of my life. And I was, sort of, I'd be the class clown and stuff like that at school. And being overweight my entire life, I would use it almost like a defense mechanism. I didn't have any deep-seated issues or anything like that. But I always loved to laugh, and I always loved bringing laughter to people, especially my dad. I loved making my father laugh. It was just loads of fun when I could do that. And I remember my first comedy record ever was Bill Cosby's "Why Is There Air?" and I was in about 5th grade, and I listened to that over and over. And then as I got older, I started to listen to other comedians, and of course, I grew up on late night not late night, the Tonight Show with Johnny Carson, and would see comics there. And so when I was in college, I entered a comedy contest that was held in the cafeteria. And it was very last minute. I was really nervous. I wasn't intending to enter, but a buddy of mine had signed up like weeks earlier. So he got up to do his thing. He was a guy I had gone to high school with, and now we're in college together. And he went up to his thing, and the MC then said, "Well, he's unopposed. Is there anybody that wants to come up?" And it was a contest that lasted weeks, and this was like the last week of it. And all my friends, mutual friends, were sitting around going, "Dan, Dan, Dan." So I got up and I winged it. I told a few jokes that I'd been working on, and so at the end of that, the MC said, "Well, we had a comedy club in town called Yuck Yucks." And he said the prize was the winner was going to go on to the club. And so at the end of the contest, my buddy won, but he said, "We'll have you go too, because you got up last minute, and it was close and all that." So we both went to Yuck Yucks. We performed a set. And then I signed up again for like a week later. And this is how dumb I was. I had no idea. That was the end of my comedy career back when I was 18 or 19 years old. And the reason being was I thought that I had to come up with the new 5 or 7 minutes every time I went to the club. So when they invited me back the following week, here I'm racking my brain like, "Oh, I got to come up with 7 new minutes." Not knowing that, no, when you're a comedian, you work on the same material over and over and hone it and craft it. So at the end of the second week, I was like, "Oh, I'm done." I couldn't think of anything else. So I didn't go back into comedy for like a good, it was like 15 years or so. And but I was touring with the band, as I mentioned, the lead singer of this rock group. When we stopped touring in about 2007, I wasn't sure what to do with my life. The other guys were fine. One guy had a family business. Another guy joined the National Guard and went and fought in Afghanistan. Another guy had his real estate license, but I didn't know what to do with my life because I put all my eggs in that basket. I thought we were going to be the next great Christian rock band out there. And so I knew I had this really great story. And I'm like, I'm going to, I think I got a friend who's a musician who had done a lot of work with our band and opened for us before and filled in on musical instruments when we were missing somebody. And he was a funny guy. And I said, I think I'll have him. His name was Jason. I think I'll have him. I'll book another tour. We'll call it the Stories, the Songs Tour. He'll do some songs and I'll tell these stories. And as time went on, the stories got funnier and funnier. And my comedian buddies, they were a comedy musical duo named Dave and Brian. They were going to be at Syracuse University one night, and which was about an hour from my home. And Dave called me up and said, "Hey, we're performing at Syracuse University. I know you're doing these funny stories. Do you want to come open for us?" And I said, "Yeah, okay, sure. That'll be fun." So I drove out to Syracuse. I opened for them. And I didn't think I did particularly well or anything like that. But Brian pulled me aside afterwards and he said, "Dan, I know you're trying to figure out what to do with your life. I think you should go into comedy. Um, and I thought, oh, okay. I thought about that all the way home. I woke my wife up at like 1:30 in the morning, who was such a trooper. She put up with me being a touring musician for all those years. Woke her up and I said, I think I'm going to go into comedy. And she sat up and she sighed. She went, or not sighed, but took a deep breath and went, okay, like here's the next, part of your journey, I guess. So the next tour that I booked without my musician buddy, and I billed myself as a comedic storyteller. So that was like the transition into being a stand-up comedian.
Wow.
So,
So going back to your, yeah, your adoption stories, and the work with pregnancy clinics, and your history with comedy. So where would you what's if I asked you about where do you see God's fingerprints in your story, serving him in these different capacities? What comes to mind as a story where you can say, I feel like God really worked here in my life, or he opened this door, or somehow, where do you see God's fingerprint in your story?
well, all over from beginning to end. I mean, this whole full circle idea of me growing up in this home with this incredible example from my parents to, and having four siblings with Down syndrome, to then being able to adopt the first child let out of China to the US with Down syndrome. And that whole story, as you read from the book, Jacob, is
Yeah.
miraculous. I mean, if you remember, we started down the road of adopting for adoption of another child, like of somebody else. And it was because I attended a Stephen Curtis Chapman concert and signed up to win a guitar and shoved it in the box. I was there with a youth group. I was a youth group leader at a church, and I said, "Oh, Stephen Curtis Chapman's coming to town. Let me bring him to this college, and they'll see a concert." I got up to go to the bathroom, and as I'm walking through the lobby, I see this display. It says, "Win Stephen Curtis Chapman's guitar." So I was like, "Yeah." I filled out a card, shoved it in, and then went off to the bathroom and went back to the concert. Um, that put me on the mailing list for the Chapman's ministry. At the time, it was called Shohana's Hope. Now it's called Show Hope. And I was getting these emails that, as a single man, I didn't care a whole lot about because they were about adoption and stuff like that. But then as I got married and my wife had this story, this experience in China, and we were considering adoption, I started to pay a little bit more attention to their newsletters. Found out about this little boy with Down syndrome, that it said something like desperately looking for a family or for parents to adopt this boy with Down syndrome from China. And I called my wife, and we had already started the process. We had paid a bunch of money in non-refundable fees. And she laughed. The first time, she laughed at me. She was like, "Oh yeah, we're going to just stop mid-road and go adopt another child." But anyway, all of those are God moments. I mean, if I never filled out that card, if I hadn't been born into the family I had been born into, if I never met Elizabeth, all of it, and my life hasn't been completely all roses. I was married years ago to somebody else, and for 5 years, and at the end of that 5 years, she left, and so I was very broken. I was very hurt. We didn't have any kids. Thank the Lord for that. Um, and I was in that broken period, in that time of great devastation. That's the time that I met the band, and that's the time that I met my wife Elizabeth. Um, and all of these incredible things happen. You could just see God cradling me and holding me and ministering to my spirit. He gave me the best friends in the world that I've ever had, and then gave me the best wife a guy could have. And I look at my children today and I say, I would never change anything from my past, because all of that led me down the road that I'm at now.
Oh, that's sweet. So, um, how would you consider encouraging a pregnancy clinic team to consider adoption? Maybe, how might you phrase it to, a team of volunteers who are providing clients with advice, or counsel, or they're advocating for clients for parenting and adoption? How might you encourage them to look at adoption? Like, as you looked at it as a plan A, how might you encourage these people who are talking to women in unplanned pregnancy scenarios? How would you encourage them to embrace the idea of adoption?
Yeah, I think that you have to tell the stories. You have to beat that drum of adoption constantly in a positive manner. What does our society show when it comes to adoptions? A lot of times you hear the horror stories. You hear about the orphan that was adopted and came home, and there was all these issues or problems, and sometimes adoption is kind of made fun of. It's like a punchline in the media and that sort of thing. But you have to tell the stories of people like me and so many countless other parents that have had these wonderful experiences with adoption, and let a woman know that that is really one of the most heroic things she can do, is to bring that baby, deliver that baby, and then give that baby to another couple. And also, one of the things they may struggle with more than anything is if they find out they get a prenatal diagnosis of some type of physical disability, or like Down syndrome or Alfie syndrome, or I told you I have a son who has spina bifida, that's getting more and more diagnosed in the womb now as well. But you have to be able to share the stories of parents who are willing to adopt children with special needs. That mom that comes into your center needs to know that there are parents that will adopt that baby no matter what. Because they may think, oh, nobody's going to want my child if they have physical disabilities or challenges. And, I also recommend to centers, when you walk into a center, what do you see often? You'll see these beautiful blown up pictures of these beautiful children, healthy children on the walls. And those are great. What I'd love to see included in some of those centers are like pictures of my son in his wheelchair. One of my favorite pictures I have of my son Shay is he's on a horse and his wheelchair is up on this deck behind the horse. He had gotten off the chair and onto the horse. And it's just this beautiful picture. I'd love to see pictures like that at centers so that people knew, you say that you value life. Let's show them all aspects of life.
So your son Shay, is that was he who's he in your list of children? Like, how did he come into your list of children?
Are you losing track, Jacob?
Well,
Yeah.
he's the new name. I'm just trying to keep track.
Yeah, so Shay was the third child we adopted.
Okay.
And we went to Ukraine 2 years after we got Danielle from China. And so he was one that my wife found online. And we flew back over to Ukraine, adopted him from an orphanage, and brought him home. He was about to turn 5 when we got him. And now that same son is 15 years old, and he just went to his regional competition in track and field. He does shot put and javelin and discus, and he also races his wheelchair. He is a wheelchair racer, I should say. He races, and he just qualified for nationals, so he'll be out in Colorado this summer competing against the best of the best.
Wow. So for those listening, how might people pray for you and your ministry and your career / ministry? How could someone pray for you in an effective way?
Oh man, thanks for asking that question. I really appreciate that. The first thing I ask people to pray for is energy. My wife and I are tired quite a bit. Like the home I grew up in, though, I can say there's a lot of humor. We love to laugh in our home, but energy is a factor. It would be great. We just feel like our home is chaos and we're running from one thing to the next all the time. So there's that. Dates are a little fewer and farther in between than we would prefer, but we still manage to have them. I do a marriage seminar at Heartbeat and CareNet quite often, and we find ways to have our date nights for sure. But the second thing would be, when COVID came, all of my appearances around the country got flushed right down the toilet within a matter of 4 or 5 days, and I'm in kind of the rebuilding stage now. So you could pray for bookings. That's part of our family income. That's how I earn a living. And I could just use more of those around the country. And so book me if you're listening to the podcast. I'd be honored
Yeah.
to come. And I just been praying lately, Jacob, that God would even expand my platform even more. So I appreciate you having me on the podcast. That's just
Oh, my
another
pleasure. So
thing.
my follow-up question is, what's the last passage you remember reading in the Bible, or the last passage that comes to mind that you remember hearing, like from a Sunday sermon?
Well, it's funny you say that, because for the last year and a half or so, I've been the interim associate pastor at my church,
Okay.
because our pastor retired, and I was first filling in for him, and then while he went on a medical leave, and then he decided he'd retire. So we're getting our new pastor in a few weeks. So I preach every Sunday, or no, excuse me, not every Sunday. I preach every few Sundays. I'll preach.
Okay.
We have an interim pastor. They just kind of had me stay on to help with this transition. So, but the last passage that I read was for a funeral that I did this past Sunday. And it talked about Jesus Christ being our advocate, and how he would go to the Father on our behalf. And he became the great sacrifice for us. So that would be the last passage. I'd have to look up the scripture reference, actually, because actually I might.
Well, the Dan Kulp paraphrase is probably fine.
Good, good. Yeah, I'm glad to hear that.
The Kulp version.
Yeah,
The Dan
but
version.
all of the scriptures that I read in funeral, that was for the main message. I always open funerals. I don't do the typical, everybody does Psalm 23. Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. That I don't use that at funerals unless I'm asked to by the family. I love opening, and I think your audience will appreciate this. I'll come out at the beginning of the funeral before I even say a word, and I start reading Psalm 139. Which is, that God knows us. He knit us together in our mother's womb. We are fearfully and wonderfully named. All the days laid out for all the days of our lives were laid out before us, before God, even before one of them came to be. Again, Dan paraphrasing, but all of those wonderful things about the value of life, and that even when we're in the darkest of darks, he is still with us. So I open with that, and then in every message that I do for a funeral, I also use Romans 8, that talks about who will separate us from the love of God, neither height nor depth or famine or sword or nakedness or hunger, and it talks about us being more than conquerors. So I think all of those are incredible scriptures, and part of this movement.
So how would those three passages, or the passage of 139, the value of life, and from Psalms, as well as Romans 8, if you were to think about those passages when it comes to your need for more energy, your need for more bookings, and in the concept of expanding your platform, how do those passages speak to those three areas of your life?
Wow. Now you're putting me on the spot. Now you're trying to convict
me. Take your time. Oh no, this is one of my favorite things, is to ask someone like what their need is, what's the last thing read in the Bible, and how does it apply?
That's pretty sneaky, Jacob. But yeah, that's a good strategy. I like that. You ought to be a pastor, you know that?
No, I'm more of a repeater.
That's pretty good. Well, the Psalm 139 speaks to that God has ordained everything. So, and I did learn that during COVID. When all of the year leading up to COVID was already my worst year in like 12 years of doing this. And I had no idea why, but I had less bookings on the calendar. But that April was going to be my best month of the entire year. I had appearances all over the place.
The month of April 2020, right? That's when everything just went.
Yep. And I was so like for months, I was like, oh, I just got to get to April. I got to get to April financially. And then it was like, I think the first 5 days of April or something like that, I just saw them fall off the calendar, and I was beside myself. I was a wreck. And I remember being in my car in the driveway sobbing. My wife actually walked out to the car, and I was just, I couldn't believe it. I thought God was really out to get me. I made it all about me, not to mention the whole world was going through this.
Yeah.
But what I saw during that year was how, again, God, like I mentioned, when my wife had left me back in the early 90s or the late 90s, God cradled me and held me and provided for our family in really incredible ways. And we ended up looking back on that year going, oh my gosh, we had blessing. Like there were blessings to us that we like never expected. And I realized, okay, it was during that year again that my pastor gave me a call and said, "Can you fill in for me for a month or two?" And then that turned into,
Oh,
now I've been doing it a year and a half. Um, uh, I saw God do that. That He was in charge the whole time. So now I've told people, if there's another COVID or another, and I hope not. I hope there's not another time where they shut everything down. I'm much more trusting and filled with faith to be able to handle that. And going on to Romans 8, it says we are more than conquerors in Christ Jesus. Uh, that's like a Braveheart kind of thing. That's just
yeah.
not that we get by. That's more than, like, what is a conqueror? A conqueror goes in and takes down everything and wins the land. The Bible tells us we're more than that. So yeah. And then the main passage that I preach from that talks about Jesus being our advocate, I can see that Jesus is always my advocate. He's always going to the Father on our behalf. So
Oh,
thank
that's
you
beautiful.
thank you for
Yeah.
turning those into my
Yeah.
life. That's wonderful that I could reflect like that in those few moments.
Awesome. Well, I really appreciate this time to talk with you and to hear your story. I mean, reading your story honestly was just phenomenal, and I would encourage people to find your book on Amazon, or I'm assuming it's on
Thank you.
Amazon, right?
Yeah, it's on
Or
Amazon. Sure.
and it
And
was Confounding the Lies by Dan
yes.
Kulp. Okay.
Yeah, and that's from the scripture that says that God uses the foolish things to confound the wise. And I always love that scripture. And I thought about it in regards to my parents and in regards to my life, how foolish it must have looked to the rest of the world as they looked at the choices my parents made. And yet the wise are confounded by, they're confounded by that. When
Yeah.
God puts his thumbprint on people's lives like that. So, and before you end this, Jacob, I do want to say that we had two more biological children. So I want to do a shout out to my daughter Emily, who's 10 now, and my little son Steven, who's 4. And they both keep
Awesome.
me hopping too.
So you have 5 kids. Wow, that's all.
5, yeah, yeah, yeah.
That feels a minivan.
Well, I was thinking about it. Yeah, it does. We're filled to the top. It fills a wheelchair accessible minivan, no less.
Okay.
Um, but I was thinking about it. I thought, I just think it keeps me young. Like I'm 52 years old. I do not feel 52, despite the gray and in this here. I don't feel like a 52-year-old. I feel younger. And I thought, let's see. All my friends who I graduated high school from, they're actually on to grandkids now. I guess that could make them feel young. But if my wife and I like started heading towards retirement, what would be, would be going to play bingo or craft fairs or what? I'm going to my daughter's picnics at school and chasing my 4-year-old around on her trampoline and stuff like that. It's bound to keep me young.
Yeah. Well, and yeah, it's 5 kids will definitely keep you young, and that's just and all the different stories. I feel like there's just so much. You can see God's fingerprints and His working through the stories, and the stories of adoption seem to have a special story when it comes to what pregnancy clinics need to share for encouraging these women that are in hard situations who might be seeking abortion, for them to consider not just parenting, but also adoption as a primary choice that
Yeah.
is life-giving and beautiful, and yeah, and just full of life.
Yeah. But I think even beside the adoption stories, the value of life story is really what connects with the centers. because I'm able to tell them by the end of my evening with them that, hey, you are my superheroes for your life-saving work. And this is one thing I say, and during the appeal, and I mean it every single time. I'll tell the audience as they're writing out their checks, I'll say, this is my favorite moment of the night, because as I look at you writing out those checks, I realize that you are the people that would never let a child be abandoned in the woods in the middle of winter on the day he was born. And I mean that. And those women that work for those centers, and those men too, they are my superheroes because of the value of life that they are fighting for on a daily basis. That's meaningful to me and my children and my wife.
Yeah, and they're the real superheroes. Superheroes in the movies are not really saving lives. Those are just fictional stories. But
Yeah, with a lot of
superheroes
special effects.
yeah,
Yeah,
and the superheroes in the pregnancy clinics are actually saving lives and helping people
right.
find the value in life.
Yeah. And that's one of my closers too, just before the appeal. I tell a funny story about watching the pilot episode of the TV show Batman. And that's not the cool looking Batman of today. That was the polyester pajama wearing Batman of yesteryear. But I tell a story about that, and how when I was a kid, I saw that. I wanted to be a hero when I grew up, but how as I grew older, my view of what a superhero was radically changed. As I looked at my
Yeah,
siblings, as I looked at my parents, as I looked at my wife, who really is my ultimate superhero. And then I tell them, all the folks, I have them stand up, and I say, you are my heroes. That's why I'm here tonight, is because of
yeah.
you.
Yeah,
You're the
the real
heroes.
superheroes work in pregnancy clinics, they work at churches, they work in the firehouse,
That's right.
helping people, getting people out of burning buildings. They work at the
Yeah.
hospitals. They work in these places where people are really being helped.
Yeah.
They don't work in Hollywood. Hollywood is fine, but saving lives, happens locally in these
Right.
certain places like pregnancy clinics and churches.
Yeah. I agree with you 100%.
So after I finished reading, when I read your book, I was making notes and highlighting. I was really enjoying it, but then I didn't
Thanks.
intend to keep it. I gave it to someone at my church, and I recycled it. So I would
Good.
encourage people who get a
Yeah.
copy of Dan's book, don't let it collect dust on your bookshelf. But make sure
Yeah.
you give it to someone else who needs to read it because it's that good.
Oh, thank you very, very much. Yeah. Well, I appreciate that. Thanks. I'm working on some
Yeah,
other books now. So, but that one took me
good.
like 7 years to write because I'm so slow at doing it. So, hopefully I'll do this next one a little bit sooner.
Yeah, you got through the learning curve on the first one. You'll be
Yeah,
next
I
one will
hope
probably get done
so.
in 4 years.
Yeah. Yeah.
So would you close our podcast by praying for maybe praying for the adoption world or in the pregnancy clinic world perhaps?
Yeah, yeah, I'd be honored to do that. Sure. Yeah, thank you. Lord, I pray right now for all of those volunteers and all of those staff that are in centers scattered all over the country and in other parts of the world as well. I pray that you would renew their strength, give them energy, God, as I prayed for tonight, or I asked for. I pray that you would affirm their life-saving work, that they would know that they are heroes because you called them to where they are and they answered the call. I pray ultimately, God, that lives would continue to be saved from the mother who walks into that center confused. I pray that you would help shine a light on her confusion and use those volunteers and staff to do that. I pray that for the mother who is struggling because they're carrying a child who has special needs or disabilities or challenges, I pray that they would be convinced to give birth to that child anyway. I pray that adoption would be a drum that gets beat over and over and over again by Christians in our country and by the centers, that they would know that there are people out there who will take these babies and love them and bring them into their family. So, God, thank you. I thank you for the life-saving work of the centers. I thank you for Jacob and his podcast, for enlightening people and shining a light on so many different people that work for the cause of life. God bless their work and walk beside them in the fight. and ask all these things in the name of Jesus. Amen.
Amen. Yeah, the prayer for energy, bookings, and expanding territory, that's definitely true for you. And it's also, I think that's also true for pregnancy clinics.
Yeah.
They need more client bookings or appointments. Like that's and the energy to, to keep on the good fight and expanding into new territory, especially with Roe being overturned soon. We're going to have to expand into the ways to keep serving women in unplanned pregnancies under new, in a new under new laws or new legal, new legal scenarios.
Yeah, it's becoming a new world, and you got to duck and weave, all the time, right? When you're in the fight.
Hear our cry, O God.
Hear our cry, O God.
Listen to our prayer.
Listen to our prayer.
From the ends of the earth we call. As our hearts grow faint.
As our hearts grow faint.
Lead us to the rock.
Lead us to the rock.
You are refuge and strong tower. Then will we ever sing praise to your name. Then will we ever sing day after day. How we long to dwell in your tent forever,
in your tent forever,
and take refuge in your wings. You have heard our vow,
you have heard our vows,
you have blessed us,
you have blessed us,
for we fear your name. Then will we ever sing praise to your name. Then will we ever sing day after day. The Christ is enthroned for all generations. Christ is enthroned in your presence forever. Christ is enthroned in love. Christ is enthroned in Hear our cry, O God.
hear our cry, O God.
Listen to our prayer.
Listen to our prayer.
From the ends of the earth we call. As our hearts grow faint,
As our hearts grow faint,
lead us to the rock.
lead us to the rock.
You are refuge and strong tower. Then will we ever sing praise to your name. Then will we ever sing day after day. Then will we ever and will